Well, Christians aren't part of the class. Anybody who's actually part of the class.
Andrew, Prado, and husband.
Okay. All right. Just a second. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, et veni Sancti Spiritus repleturum, corda fidelium et suum oris in signum accende, imite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Remus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus solus racine coisti, danamis in iorum Spiritu rectus apere, et de eius semper constantine godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed sapientiae. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Close to the final batch of noticing. Feel like a copy.
Follow along.
Right. Right, almost at the beginning of these notes here. So actually, we're still on page 98. That's where we'll start. So we're talking about the conversion of Clovis and how many followed him into baptism. Many of the subjects. You have the whole detailed account given in the notes. We don't have to go through all of it. In fact, much of what we still have left to cover, we'll have to go through a little more quickly because we're short on time. But move on to successive pages, even if that's where we start, page 98. In fact, we'll move on to... Okay, let's move on to the Pontificate of St. Symmachus. That is on page 100 of the notes. So 498 to 514. He was a deacon when he was elected to succeed St. Anastasius II, who was his immediate predecessor. And this is an instance of someone being elected who is not actually even a priest. And that can happen. He had to, of course, be consecrated a bishop. A relatively recent example of a pope being elected who was not a bishop was Pope Gregory XVI, who was very famously in the 19th century, early 19th century, consecrated a bishop and crowned pope the same day. Just imagine what those ceremonies would have been like. Probably taken all day long. So, his first act of authority was the convocation of a council in the Basilica of St. Peter to regulate the manner of pontifical elections, and thus to preclude the recurrence of the canvassing and factions which had marked his consecration. So, human nature is human nature, and you get things like that in any, under any circumstances, really. People will start campaigning and so on and so forth. and that's not a good thing. So this is why popes will sometimes change the rules regarding papal elections, because they want to avoid problems that have come before. And St. Pius X did that famously because he didn't like the way that his own election came about. That's for later sections of church history, but it's because of St. Pius X that now conclaves are carried out in secret. That was St. Pius X who enacted that. That's why prior to the election of St. Pius X, we have the exact, in many cases, we have the exact number of votes that different candidates got on different ballots, because it was all very public. Nothing wrong with that in itself, but St. Pius X didn't like the fact that there was the veto of the Austrian emperor was exercised that brought about his election. So he made it secret after that, made it clear no veto, nobody has any veto power, and also this to be done in secret. So that's why that was done in succeeding conclaves. So this council, anyway, this council that St. Symmachus called, numbered 72 bishops, 67 priests, and 5 deacons. 3 canons were drawn up relative to the election of the sovereign pontiff. So you have the exact details given there. And this is something that it was even as late as St. Pius X changes were made to the rules regarding papal elections. So these decrees were subscribed by all the bishops, priests, and deacons in the assembly. Among the signatures appears the name of the archpriest Lawrence of the title of St. Praxedes, the same who had been elected anti-pope previous to this. So this ambitious priest had promised Festus that in case he were placed upon the papal throne, he would conform to the wishes of the Emperor Anastasius and sign the Henoticon. Remember the so-called Decree of Union, which caused anything but union and was not authorized anyway by any pope ever. Its problems we won't get into right now. We've talked about it before. We don't have time to rehash all of it. But the point is that there was a schism, a mini schism here, not a big one like the Greek or Russian schisms, but there had been a schism there. Sometimes smaller schisms arise in the history of the church. Someone gets overly ambitious and decides to make himself an anti-pope. Perhaps some number of clergy, even bishops, will follow him. But most of those get resolved fairly quickly, relatively quickly and easily, as opposed to the other bigger, more famous schisms. This one seemed to be at an end, perhaps rekindled to some extent, but clearly this is not a tremendous one in the history of the church, so I won't spend too much time on it. Get moved past most of this. Much of what we see here will have to be still be read. I'll give study guides, so we'll have to have study guides. I'll specify the dates for all the quizzes, but so study guides incoming. But much of this will be covered on quizzes. We just don't have time to discuss all of it. Much of it is detail that is not absolutely essential. So the St. Symmachus did much, point being to bring about the schisms that kept arising in the East, which were not yet the Phocian schism, or the later on the Greek schism that would finally, that really lasts to this day, but there's still a great deal of schism in the East. We've already seen that, and we'll continue seeing it. So the final, much longer lasting schisms that such things came about is really no surprise, given how much trouble the church had in the East for a long time, even before that. So we'll move on to the pontificate of St. Hormisdas, who succeeded St. Symmachus in July of 514. Constantinople was at this time the scene of a revolution which had well nigh proved fatal to Anastasius. So Emperor Anastasius, had caused a lot of trouble to the church. I think it was the Emperor Zeno who initially put forward the Henoticon, but Anastasius also pushed for it. And this can happen, though, especially in Constantinople, that someone who causes trouble for the church might himself then get trouble from his own subjects. This is on page 104, the Pontificate of St. Hormisdas. The emperor, in his strange mania for changing everything, one day made known his intention of reforming the Gospels, as he thought their style too simple. So imagine the hubris of that. He also wished to change the liturgy, and especially to oblige the clergy and faithful to sing the Chrysagion with the heretical additions made to it by Peter the Fuller, one of those intruder bishops. The Catholics opposed these sacrilegious innovations, The new patriarch Timothy, on the other hand, encouraged them with all his influence. So the point being here, more trouble in the East. There's all kinds of trouble all the time, but this is just the latest episode of it. The emperor causing trouble, bishops, whether true bishops or intruder bishops, causing trouble. The emperor maintains his throne, but suffers attempt to overthrow him. And there were, in fact, Catholics, faithful Catholics, those who were true to the faith, we could say at any rate, would not have been upset with the overthrow of Anastasius, given the amount of trouble he had caused the church. But this is also oftentimes such occasions, an overthrow or attempted overthrow, an attempted coup, or a military setback is oftentimes the occasion of some kind of overture on the part of civil power, which has hitherto caused trouble for the church, to the effect that they tried to come to some kind of terms with the church. That happened to Napoleon, for example. He saw for a long time he mainly just caused trouble for the church, but sometimes when he suffered, there was at least one occasion on which he suffered a major setback, that he tried to patch things up with Pope Pius VII. So that happens too. In any case, Pope Hormisdas sees the occasion, the opportunity of extinguishing a heresy which had so long desolated the church. He sent to Constantinople, so as soon as he saw an opening, some kind of a cooling of the animosity shown to the church, he sent to Constantinople as legates Saint Honorius, a successor of Saint Epiphanius in the See of Pavia, another bishop named Fortunatus, Venantius, a priest, the deacon Vitalis, and a notary Hilarius, who received written and minutely detailed instructions for the purpose of dealing with the emperor, those sent to, in a sense, represent the Pope in negotiating or patching things up with the emperor. And so at length, on the 20th of March of 519, the Act of Reunion, healing a schism in the East, penned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, was publicly read in the Basilica of the Eastern Capital, in which was worded this way: that we received the decrees of the four ecumenical councils, which perhaps were the only ones that had been up to that time, of Nice, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, which, remember, the Henoticon had failed to recognize some of those, and the Henoticon, to rehash it to some extent, seemed not to contain anything in it that was explicitly heretical, but indirectly so, inasmuch as it failed to take into account various ecumenical councils of the church, general councils, which had been approved of by the Pope and which were binding on all the faithful. And so that was a problem. And also, as we anathematize all heretics, especially Nestorius, former bishop of Constantinople and condemned in the Council of Ephesus by the blessed Pope St. Celestine. We anathemize Eutyches and Dioscorus, bishops of Alexandria, who were condemned by the Holy Council of Chalcedon. We include in the same condemnation the parricide, Timothy, called Elurus, and his disciple Peter, should be Mongus of Alexandria. We anathematize also Acacius, once bishop of Constantinople, their accomplice and partisan. So this is all good, this is all correct. By following in all things the authority of the Apostolic See, we hope to remain unshaken in our devotion to the communication of the chair of St. Peter, the true and solid foundation of the Church, the center of unity and source of authority. So the legate sent to Rome 2 copies of the formula, subscribed by the Patriarch, one in Greek, another in Latin. The names of Acacius, Zeno, and Anastasius were erased from the diptychs, and notice the importance of that, of making sure that, remember, the diptychs were the indicators of whose names were to be put into the sacred liturgy, the Mass itself, most importantly, of course. And notice this is of vital importance that you not name people in the sacred liturgy who ought not to be named. You have to apply that to the unicum Mass, the pinnacle of all such considerations. Who is named as Pope in the canon of the Mass is something that is, in fact, of capital importance. So thus ended the Eutychian schism of Constantinople, which had lasted 35 years since the condemnation of Acacius. So that's quite think about 35 years, that's more than half a lifetime. That's a long time in human terms for a schism to last, but that, of course, is dwarfed by the length of time for which other schisms have lasted and continue to last. So, the question of grace had once more arisen in the Church of Africa, which had been so cruelly decimated by King Thrasimund. So keep in mind, we are definitely in the aftermath of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We're talking about the emperor, that is the Emperor of Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Empire. It has different names, but that is the emperor that we're talking about now, the Emperor of Constantinople. And keep in mind, they do still claim, they still just claim to be the Roman emperors. They still claim the entire Roman Empire to its full extent, but they're doing clearly next to nothing outside of causing trouble in fighting over and being killed and mutilated in Constantinople. That's pretty much the occupation of, with some exceptions, but that's largely the occupations of the Eastern Roman emperors at this point. We'll see some notable exceptions, but at least one. But that's generally what they're up to now, causing trouble for the church. Certainly among their pastimes. So, once again, theological controversy in Africa. The Pope at this time bestowed the rank of Primate of Spain upon the Bishop of Tarragona, yet confirming the same dignity granted by St. Simplicius to the Bishop of Seville for the provinces of Andalusia and Portugal. In a decretal addressed to all the Spanish bishops from Ormuzdas, forbade the ordination of priests per saltum, that is, without observing the intervals prescribed by the canons. So that discipline still exists in the church to this day. That in order to that an ordination be licit, not valid, but licit, it has to be only after having gone through all the other steps, having received tonsure, all the minor orders, and then the subdiaconate, and then the diaconate, then finally the priesthood. And to do anything else is gravely illicit. And in principle, their dispensations can be granted, which means that today epikeia can be applied when there's reason. Such things can be dispensed, but they are meant to be intervals, interstices, as they're called, in between the receptions of the various orders, especially the major orders. The idea being to make sure that the candidate for the priesthood is adequately prepared for each and every single step. And so per saltum meaning through a kind of jump, to just jump straight into the priesthood from zero or from significantly less than after having gone through nearly all the steps is gravely illicit. And that is actually sometimes still done, even in the traditional movement to this day, and that is, in fact, in itself a grave abuse to do that. So we still have to observe, yes, through epikeia we have to set aside, in fact, many laws of the church for the good of souls, but not this one, because it's part of preparation for the priesthood to go through all the steps as they are supposed to be observed. So orders also could not be conferred upon public penitents, meaning someone who's doing public penance for public sin. Obviously, such a person is, even if he might become a saint after doing that and be clearly a worthy candidate for the priesthood, still while doing public penance ought not to be admitted to the priesthood. The church does not need that. So strict inquiry must be made into the honesty and learning of the candidate. All of this really just common sense, but notice if popes are laying down laws to this effect, that means that these were things that should have been done, but which were not being done, at least not everywhere. There was enough deviation from what was clearly recognized as what ought to be done to make it necessary for laws to be passed. That's typical, that's human nature, that is why laws are passed, because people are not doing what they should already be doing. What is clearly already expected of them they are not doing, and so laws have to be promulgated, explicitly written down, made crystal clear, that's the idea anyway, with punishments indicated for what will happen if you don't conform. All of that happens on the occasion of people not doing what they really should be doing. That's not the only occasion for laws to be promulgated, but it is typical. All right, so then the pontificate of Pope John I. He was, in fact, Saint John I. He was chosen to succeed Saint Armistas on the 13th of August of 523 A.D. The Emperor Justin, wishing to strike a decisive blow at Arianism, disqualified all Arians for any trust, either military or civil. And so that is, in itself, not a bad idea, to exclude all heretics from any kind of public office. That's a good idea in itself. It might not always be the most prudent thing to do, but it is a good idea in itself. So Theodoric had always professed Arianism, even while paying the homage we have recorded to the virtue and learning of Catholic bishops. Justin's decree aroused the sectarian spirit, which had then quietly slumbered in the breast of Theodoric. So this is Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths declared that if the emperor's edicts were carried out, he would retaliate fearfully upon the Italian Catholics. So this is an example of a case in which the emperor might be justified in not enforcing the strictest rules against heretics, which in themselves are good rules. It makes absolutely all the sense in the world that heretics should be excluded from public office. Or heretics are rebels. If it makes no sense to install an attempted assassin, someone who tried to kill the king and commit regicide, if it would make no sense to install such a person in a public office, then it makes no sense whatsoever in comparison to that to install a heretic in a public office. I mean, that is a far worse crime to push heresy. That's in itself worse than to try to commit murder. Far, far, far worse. And so that in itself is a rule, that's a law that makes perfect sense, but it's sometimes even good rules, good laws can be per accidens, can be by accident the occasion of worse evils than they were intended to fix to begin with, and so it might not be enforced or even repealed for the sake of avoiding some greater evil. Theodoric, it seems, minister Cassiodorus was unwilling to follow his master into the violent reaction he was preparing. He quit the court, and the spirit of wisdom which had hitherto regulated the administration left with him. Theodoric summoned the Pope to Ravenna. Go to Constantinople, the king said to him, and required the Emperor Justin to allow the Arians who have been forcibly converted to return to Arianism. Do with me what, so that's his claim at least, that people are being forced to convert. Now sometimes, in itself, it's a good idea to make sure that heretics are set apart. And it's just part of protecting the state that heretics be treated as persons guilty of treason. But to actually enforce that can sometimes occasion unintended evils. And so on such occasions, there might be reason to pull back the enforcement, somewhat at least. And this is an example of what can happen, of things, cases in which prudence might dictate that really maybe we have to tolerate something here, which is an evil. And keep in mind that is a toleration that we're talking about. The existence of error or the presence of heretics is an evil in itself, never to be recognized as something good within the state, but it might sometimes be necessary to tolerate it. I mean, necessary in the sense of truly being the means without which, on this occasion, greater evils will in fact not be avoided. So, there are such examples throughout history, and this is one of them, it seems. And his claim, the claim of the heretic Ostrogoth Theodoric, is that people are being forced to give up heresy and embrace the faith. He probably doesn't phrase it that way, but that's essentially his claim. You have to take it case by case to see whether that's actually true. But sometimes an evil that might sometimes arise, unintended evils that might arise among those evils, arising from good policies, good laws, good rules, is that people might convert only apparently. There might be an insincere conversion made for the purpose of trying to remove from oneself the pressures that are being exerted upon heretics, or anybody who adheres to any kind of a false so-called religion. So that's his claim anyway. But on this occasion, though, the pontiff says, "Do with me what you will. I am in your hands, but such a proposal I cannot make, as it would be an apostasy." So he's saying, no, actually, he deems that to be being removed from the exact circumstances. It could be hard to say what exactly was the case versus what it was that the Pope was seeing, but certainly the Pope and especially canonized Pope, presumption is in his favor, so he's saying, no, I'm not going to do that. So Theodoric still insisted upon his going to Constantinople to assure the Emperor Justin that if he prescribed Arianism in the East, Catholicity would pay the penalty in the West. So the Pope yielded and set out for Constantinople, accompanied by 5 Italian bishops. This was the first time that the head of Christendom, the Roman Pontiff, had undertaken such a journey. So notice that we're well into the 6th century now, and it's the first time that a Pope has really ever left Rome. They've always just lived in Rome, which is not really the place where the Pope belongs in many senses. But in this case, the Pope is going to Constantinople for a very serious reason, to avoid a widespread persecution of the Church in Italy. So the Pope was met at the distance of 12 miles from the city by a countless throng of the faithful. So clearly there are, despite all the trouble in the East, there are still many good Catholics there. The Emperor Justin bowed in humble reverence before him and entreated the favor of receiving the crown from his hand. Justin was the first emperor crowned by a pope. So that would, starting a long tradition of popes or kings, as the case might be, being crowned by the Pope himself. That's a very good thing. It indicates the fact that the civil power. It's not to say that the power of civil power necessarily goes through the Pope, but in some cases it does. And that can be the arrangement. For example, in the order that's coming about, the order of the Catholic Middle Ages, theoretically, all of Western Europe they were all fiefs of the Pope. All these rulers would give their nations to the Pope, at least symbolically, and perhaps truly, but more by way of symbolism than anything else, and then receive them back from the Pope as being fiefs. So, in those cases, when that was the idea that the Pope was technically the overlord of all these Catholic nations, they were receiving their civil power through him, even then. But that's not necessarily the case. In other words, to be legitimate, one not need necessarily be personally approved of by the Pope. It would not be a bad idea, but that need not be the case necessarily. So but it is still even it is under any circumstances that is a healthy thing. That the civil rulers should be crowned by the Pope to indicate that the power of the civil order is of a lesser order than that of the spiritual power. So the Pope yielded to his earnest wishes and afterward communicated with all the Eastern bishops, only excepting Timothy of Alexandria, who still refused to receive the Council of Chalcedon. So our author refers to him as the Patriarch of Alexandria, at least supposed Patriarch of Alexandria. When St. John I had received all the marks of respect and reverence due to his dignity, he entered upon the business that had brought him to Constantinople. He represented to the Emperor Justin the evils which threatened Italy, and without in the least giving way to error, said that all possible freedom for repentance should be granted to every conscience. The emperor yielded to his reasoning, and the Arians were left in peace. So clearly, on this occasion, prudence dictated that maybe not go too hard on the heretics, more harder than can be managed without causing retaliation elsewhere. So this is a good example of these principles we've mentioned. Also, sometimes a toleration, and not more than a toleration, that has always be clear, not more than a toleration of heresy and heretics sometimes might be, unfortunately, necessary to certain ends. So this duty fulfilled, the Pope set out on his return, loaded with rich presents by Justin, but instead of the honors which met him in the East, a cruel and cheerless prison awaited him in the West. So Theodoric had put to death on unjust suspicion the most learned of the Romans, the illustrious senator Boetius, who is very famous as an author as well. So Boetius was a Christian of deep conviction, meaning actually a Catholic. Those are objectively synonymous terms. Unfortunately, nowadays someone claims to be a Christian, uses that exact label, uses those exact syllables, pronounces those exact letter sounds. Usually that means he's a heretic, unfortunately. Objectively, Christian, Catholic are the same term, synonymous terms. They mean the exact same thing. And that's how our author is using it here, obviously, in its true sense. Not its, unfortunately, much more common hijacked sense that we have to deal with now. About the details of the life of Boetius, his works, the persecution he suffered, and finally being put to death. Also, his Symmachus, his father-in-law, deeply versed in both sacred and profane learning, and like him, also the friend and advisor of the popes. This is on page 107. Met with the same fate in the following year. So he was essentially tortured to death and then executed, or executed by means of being tortured to death, grisly fashion. So the Pope reached Ravenna only to be thrown into a dungeon by order of Theodoric, who was displeased, as he said, with the issue of the embassy to Constantinople. So the Pope made this tremendous concession to him of actually going in person to Constantinople to try to get the emperor to be nicer, or as nicer. Nicer. That makes it sound as though it's something he was obliged to do on some title. To get him to tolerate heretics and heresy, and the Pope did that for the sake of the general peace of the Church. But he's still, Theodoric is being a pain, a huge pain, we'll say, and still is not satisfied. And that, you see, is a pattern that will very much develop throughout the succeeding centuries of the history of the Church, that typically that's true. Popes will make concessions, but those to whom they make the concessions are never, ever satisfied. It's never enough as far as they're concerned. They're still disgruntled. They still come back from work. And you can see that even arguably, that's what certainly led to two different schools of thought amongst the popes. Those who granted concessions, maybe the next one will be the one that finally satisfies these people, and the other school of thought being no concessions. Not zero, maybe not absolutely no concessions, but definitely the school of thought that says, let's err on the side of standing fast on the rights of the Church, come what may. And because we're not going, if we give up anything, we'll not get it back, at least not, the Pope could undo any concession at any moment, because it is nothing more than that, a concession ultimately. But that would probably cause a lot of trouble. And indeed, that has happened. So St. Pius X, for example, when he, certain clashes he had with the horrible, just absolutely horrible French Third Republic government, when he pulled out when he refused to conform to what they wanted, that meant the end of a concordat that existed between the Holy See and the French government and the Third Republic. Now, in hindsight, that was a very good move on the part of St. Pius X, because there's no way the Third Republic, given what it was going to be any nicer to the Church under any circumstances. And St. Pius X is now canonized for doing things such as that, taking a hard line on everything. That's why St. Pius X got canonized. Yeah, realistically, we can say that. I mean, yes, certainly considerations of personal sanctity were part of it, but notice it's always the hardline popes are the ones who either get canonized or who at least whose causes for canonization are opened. As in the past, obviously by now, better part of 600 years, 500 years anyway, there are very, very few popes who have been canonized, but St. Pius V, St. Pius X, and I think it was Pius IX. I'm not sure if his cause for canonization was open prior to Vatican II, but another hardline pope, in many ways hardline pope, who started out liberal, turned hardline, and he is not one of those who, if there's anyone whose cause for canonization would be opened, in addition to the other popes we mentioned, he'd be on the short list. It is of such popes that there is this sense that they really have something heroic happening here. Just stand up to all of the nonsense leveled by so many horrible people through so many years. So in any case, so the Pope sank under the weight of his imprisonment and died on May 27th of 526. Theodoric outlived his august victim by but 3 months. The avenging hand of God seemed to weigh heavily upon the tyrant. He fell into a deep melancholy and became a prey to the most gloomy forebodings. This is a fairly common thing. This is a fairly common phenomenon. that people who give the Holy See, or and that might mean the Pope personally, a great deal of trouble, many times they meet, say, a dramatic end. Think of, among various examples, well, this is one of them. Think of Julian the Apostate. Think of Napoleon. All the trouble he gave to the church over so many years. He died in exile on the little island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pope Pius VII, who was not a hardliner by any means, but who still reigned throughout all those years, suffering all that trouble from Napoleon. When Napoleon died almost alone on this little island, this little abandoned island, mostly abandoned, Pius VII was reigning gloriously from Rome in the period of the post-revolutionary Restoration, early 19th century in Rome. And so the question is, who ultimately emerged victorious, just on a personal level between the two of them? That was clearly the Pope. And Napoleon made some mentions. He acknowledged that in some way. I think even on his deathbed, or towards the end of his life anyway, acknowledged that really it was the papacy that has emerged victorious here. And that, in spite, consider all of the, on some level, glorious victories of Napoleon, all of that came to nothing ultimately. Whereas the papacy, of course, there hasn't been an actual pope in a long time, but the papacy is still an office that exists. The office of the French emperor does not. So the Ostrogoth power, which Theodoric had established in Italy, was doomed to a speedy fall, and 8 years later saw the Italian peninsula under the scepter of the Eastern emperors. So, and we'll see why that is. That's a fairly unusual thing, that the emperor from Constantinople would actually do anything to try to manage or protect a place as far away from Constantinople as Italy. That's a rather unusual thing, but it did happen. We'll see this particular century, the 6th century, the last time that an emperor in Constantinople tried to be not just the Byzantine emperor, but the Roman emperor. The ruler of the Roman Empire, the older Roman Empire. So the return of we'll go to the pontificate of Saint Felix IV, who was elected pope on the 12th of July of 526. The king of the Goths, who had caused the death of Saint John I in a dungeon, had sought to influence the election of the new pontiff, but such was the harmony of action on the part of the Roman clergy and people that Theodoric's efforts proved utterly fruitless. In the following year, the year following the accession of Pope Felix IV, Justin had his nephew Justinian, this is a very famous Byzantine emperor, Justinian, crowned as Augustus, and died himself a few months later, closing his prosperous reign over the choice of a successor able to carry on his work. So Justinian was in many ways good. He did a great deal of good, but was not perfect. We'll see that. As our author points out here, he would have been an accomplished prince had he not marred his fame by an unworthy union. So in spite of the remonstrances of Justinian and of the whole court, he married a vile courtesan named Theodora, for whom he had conceived an unbridled passion. So that was at least a reputation. She was considered generally to have been a prostitute. And he married a prostitute for whatever reason. As soon as he ascended the throne, Justinian publicly shared his power with the object of his shameful affection. Theodora had the full disposal of the army, the senate, the magistracy, and the finances. So she was tremendous power. Certainly she had a great deal of influence, whether she was in fact a prostitute or not. That's certainly her reputation. That's how it's come down in most history books. But whatever the case with regard to that, she certainly exercised a great deal of influence. Generals, senators, and even governors of provinces were at her feet. In the prologue to one of his laws, Justinian announces that he has consulted the most honorable spouse given him by heaven. So it seems that she probably had more influence than she should have had under any circumstances. So we will move further down. So Justinian, for one thing, was a Catholic. He was not a schismatic, also had the faith. Theodora had openly embraced Eutychianism, so monophysitism, the heresy. There's only one nature in the Word incarnate. So the emperor was kind, affable, accessible to us. This is Dara. So anytime anybody he likes, he puts on a pedestal. Anybody he doesn't like, he destroys completely. So certainly she was of lesser character than he, and that seems beyond doubt here. But in any case, we'll move on past the contrast of their characters here. Justinian's best claims is on page 108 in the right-hand column, number 18. Justinian's best claim to the remembrance of posterity is undoubtedly his code of laws, which constitutes the body of the Roman law, the basis of our present system of jurisprudence, at least in some countries, the basis of jurisprudence. He had long been contemplating a thorough readjustment of the statutes and put it in execution in the very first year of his reign. So this code, known as the Justinian Code, was completed within the year. It contains a collection of all the imperial constitutions from the time of Adrian until the year 534. Meanwhile, Athalaric, successor of Theodoric on the Gothic throne of Italy, published a law confirming the rights of the Roman clergy. So this is one of the advantages of a strictly monarchical system of government. In other words, every form of government is, as we've said before, a monarchy, or at the end of the day. But having a system in which one man rules is the best for many reasons, but one of them, this is what Catholic political philosophers say, in itself, it's the best among other reasons, because of the fact that bad rulers will come in any system, and in a monarchical system, that ruler will someday just die, and maybe somebody better will come along. That's one of the advantages of that kind of system. So in this case, in fact, you have a better successor. The successor is better. Sometimes that happens just because a successor sees what his predecessor did, the effects of his policies, and realizes, okay, that caused all kinds of problems. I'm not going to make those same mistakes, even if it's just on the level of being a responsible civil ruler, even if it's not for higher motives than that. Sometimes it can happen that a successor will stop persecuting the church just because he realizes that causes trouble in the country. We don't want that. We need peace with the church. Yeah, Napoleon, actually, for all of his problems, talking about how problematic Napoleon was, he did allow Catholics to practice the faith. He gave the church all kinds of trouble, no doubt of that. But he did allow Catholics to practice the faith in France, which had been the practice of the faith in a non-schismatic situation had been persecuted by the revolutionary governments. Napoleon saw that if we don't allow Catholics to practice, faithful Catholics to practice the faith in union with Rome in France, there will never be peace in France. He realized he needed, obviously, in order to wage, his favorite thing to do was to wage war, and he realized in order to do that, he needed a united nation behind him. That he couldn't be fighting internal wars as well as wars with the rest of the world practically at the same time. So he had to at least patch things up in France, the nation that he was ruling. And so, not for the best of motives, it seems, but he did indeed allow Catholics to practice the faith without any hindrance. So, in this case, Athalaric, successor of Theodoric, published a law confirming the rights of the Roman clergy. So you can see the details of it there. The same law also confirmed the exemption from secular tribunals in favor of clerics, which had already become customary. So that's true. There are certain crimes because of which clerics might be tried by the civil power, but only after they've been reduced to the lay state. So the first thing to do, any accusation is brought against a cleric, that ought to be in an ecclesiastical court. And if in the ecclesiastical court it's deemed that a guilty verdict is handed down, we'll say it can happen that cleric be reduced to the lay state and then handed over to the civil power for prosecution of perhaps the same crimes, but as a civil crime. But clerics should, in that sense, be completely exempt from, as clerics, should be completely exempt from secular courts. Now, the church will be responsible in cases of true offenses being committed, at least ones that are heinous enough to warrant severe punishment by the state. The church will reduce that cleric to the lay state and hand him over to the state, but only in that due process. So that's the point is the state should not be dragging clerics before it, even in cases of maybe clear instances of a cleric having done something for which the state would be justified in seeking punishment of that crime. The state cannot take it upon itself to just go and start arresting and prosecuting clerics. Only after due process has been carried out by the church. So, Darius explains it here. Pretty much what we say: clerics, whatever may be their fault, are first of all accountable to their bishop, the ordinary. They have given up all the benefits of civil life to place themselves at the service of every want, of every misery. Should they be ever so unhappy as to betray their holy vocation, it belongs to the bishop to examine the grievousness of their fault before giving them up, should such a necessity arise to the secular wrong. So it's not inconceivable that that should happen, but it must be done with due process. No doubt of that. So the care of St. Felix IV for the interests of the faith reached every part of the Catholic world. Semi-Pelagianism, so a mitigated version of Pelagianism, was reviving in southern Gaul, which is transforming now into France, notwithstanding the zeal of the pious bishops of that province. So a council of bishops of southern Gaul held on the 3rd of July in 529 at Orange, on the occasion of the dedication of a church in that city, subscribed to these decisions of Felix IV. So ones we have earlier in the notes, but we'll move on past that. So we'll move on to the pontificate of St. Boniface II, which lasted for a couple of years. During this time, there was a schism, which was happily not too long lasting. All right, so move past that, just to mention that. Not every pontificate needs to be gone through in too much detail, but we do, during this reign, we do have the emergence of St. Benedict. Let's see what's active during this reign. St. Benedict was certainly active for more than 2 years, but he was active during this time. He, of course, founded the very famous Abbey of Monte Cassino, which still exists to this day. Was destroyed on at least, I think, multiple times, but most recently during World War II, very famously, in fact. It's been rebuilt since then, but was destroyed during that time. So, St. Benedict founded his order and built up multiple monasteries. There were multiple monasteries built up even during his lifetime for the Benedictines, who are what we might call a very decentralized order. Some orders say, for example, the Jesuits are very centralized. Dominicans, probably something similar, but the Jesuits are famous for being very centralized. They have a very strong central government everybody answers to, all the members of the order, whereas the Benedictines, the focus is very much on all the different monasteries. Everything has to be governed, but it's just a matter of how it's done. It's all with the approval of the Holy See in any case. So there's a great deal, for example, made of what the Superior General of the Jesuits says and does. Whereas for the Benedictines, the focus is very much on what the abbot of the monastery does. So we don't have to, time to go through all the details of this. The establishment of the Benedictine order. It's very interesting, certainly very edifying to read the life of St. Benedict if you ever have the opportunity to do that. But we won't go through too much of this now. It would be very nice to, but I'm just running short on time this year to cover what we need to cover. Obviously, that's Pope St. John II. That should be January of 532 to April of 535, obviously. Did not reign for 103 years, but instead only 3 years. Typos happen. Right, so St. John II was consecrated as a pope, meaning pope it seems in this case, unless he was not a bishop when he was first elected, but that doesn't just don't mention that one or the other here. So he was soon became pope on the 22nd of January 532. During the vacancy of the Holy See, several candidates have been guilty of the seminarical proceedings, and the sacred vessels had even been publicly put up for sale. So seminary means, well, it's a very famous term, but it refers to the attempted, emphasis on attempted, buying or selling of spiritual things, which cannot be bought or sold, but the attempt to do so is still a grave sin. And the reason it's called simony is because the first one to try that was Simon Magus, who tried to purchase, and it was ordination or episcopal consecration, maybe both, from St. Peter, who essentially, you can read the exact words in the Acts of the Apostles, but told him very definitely, no, I'm not doing that, don't get lost. That refused to do it, but the point is that was the first attempt, at least the first one we have recorded in sacred history, of someone attempting the crime of simony. And that, when you know you've really messed up, if a sin gets named after you, and everybody throughout thousands of years down the history of the church refers to it by your name. So that was the case of Simon Magus. So the first one, at least first we know of, who attempted simony. All right, we'll stop there for today. So that's an abuse, obviously, that St. John II is going to have to deal with. Numele Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men subsuum presidium confugimus, Sancte Dei Genitrix nostros purgationes et despicias, in necessitatibus et periculis cunctis libera nos semper virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Numele Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Copies of notes. These two should get those to those. Just put them in their mailboxes. I'll bring out a third copy. Right? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
All right, those can go in the mailboxes.